Yo, let's talk character design. Let's do this. All right. So, one thing is collect enough reference, both picture reference as well as style reference. Ideally, when I work in Harmony, I try to put the like any design brief details that are going to be off to the sides because none of that stuff will show up. I put the references off to the side because that little box, that little frame, that little field is where all of the visual stuff will be. Um, so I'm gonna design this burly character, and I'm looking at my reference, and I'm doing like shape silhouette study to think to myself like visually, stylistically, like what do I want to do? What do I want to go for? So I start putting check marks next to things, and I start looking at these elements from the picture reference of things that I want to take, things that I want to get, and like spending the time to collect your reference is important, and spending the time to do your shape silhouette design is important. Part of the reason that the shape silhouette design is important and essential is because in general your characters will almost always be seen in their silhouette reads. There's always a moment where your characters will be read in silhouette, so it's important that their silhouette read is distinct from each other. And this part does not have to be long and laborious, right? It just needs to be you working quickly, thinking about um, the meaning of shapes and whether or not the meaning of shapes apply to your character. It's somewhat different when you start looking at some of the more quote unquote realistic anime esque characters. They don't necessarily subscribe to the sort of Disney esque principles that a lot of cartoon characters are designed. So you won't often see in a lot of anime design that there's distinct differences between the sort of hero and villains because a lot of anime doesn't have that sort of um, simplicity to the way that they deal with characters. So you oftentimes have the liberty when you're designing anime characters, if that's kind of the realm that you design in, that you don't necessarily have to think as much about the shape silhouette read having that much influence on the design of your character. But it doesn't mean that you throw those concepts and ideas away. So this whole exploration is to try as much as possible to just think the differences between I want this heavy, bulky character uh, and playing with these really big shapes. I want the character to be a little bit gruff, a little bit aggressive, but I also want the character to have some softness to it. So it's not solely just aggressive. And again, I'm when I do this, I'm thinking through some of the reference elements. Like I'm thinking maybe I could use some suspenders, maybe I could do some boots, uh, maybe I could do something with the sort of fur jacket type thing. And so the direction is that again 1920s prohibition, a gruff character, and it doesn't specify whether it's male or female. But I thought, it'll be interesting, or at least it'll be fun if it was more of a sort of gruff female character or a gruff woman. Like she's been through some things and she's like, I know how to take care of business. So that's the sort of mechanic that I'm going for. So all I did was I pasted this down, and I like to use Harmony to design because I know that in theory, if this is a 2DS project, there's a great probability that it'll end up being animated in Harmony. So I start with my silhouettes, and then I start thinking about designing inside of those silhouettes. So I use the picture reference, and I try to use that as much as possible to inform what I want to do design wise. The important part about when you're designing characters is that they don't have to be right the first time you draw them. They don't have to be correct. And you have so much flexibility and freedom in your proportions that you can smush, move things around, explore different avenues. And, you can look at it and say to yourself, like, ooh, I like some of what's going down there, but it feels a little bit too generic, or it doesn't quite feel feminine enough. So I'm going to go a different direction. And even if you start with a specific silhouette, you're not locked into like, this is the silhouette. I can't do anything outside of that. It's to your benefit to, when you see things in the process of designing, that if it's just not working, that you feel comfortable saying, this is not working, I need to go a different direction. Even if you've worked out some of what you want to do silhouette wise, that you look at it and you're, throughout the whole process, you are designing, you are making decisions, you are making choices, and you got to feel comfortable with the idea that, even with my shape silhouette design, like maybe I'm not quite where I need to be design wise. And you keep exploring, and then even just, go back and look at your reference and look at elements that you thought were interesting, fun, compelling, and say, how can I incorporate those elements to plus the design of this character? So a lot of this is just, it's drawing, looking at, okay, I like the idea of those canisters, but I was like, it's just not, visually it wouldn't work in a more stationary position. When I, ideally, I would probably add that in later. But I thought to myself, if this character does have some, like every once in a while, that she'll potentially use her feminine wiles. So that's the only reason that, she has large breasts, is to play with that mechanic of, her being, this sort of really strong character, but using the most minimal amount of quote unquote sex appeal when absolutely positively necessary, right? And it's not, I don't think that's ever just reserved for feminine characters. It's potentially something that a male masculine character can do as well. It is not to genericize and say, oh, I'm just gonna, sexualize his character. But the reality is that there's a high likelihood that a heavy set character could potentially have large breasts. So if you look at this and you go, this guy's just making large breasts just for the sake of doing it, it's not. There is thought behind it, and you can see that for the most part, like she's very reserved. There's a lot of cover. You don't even see her arms, which potentially that would be the idea for this. I thought it would be very cool that if she ever really has to get into it, that she can, kind of do the superhero esque reveal where she throws off her basically her fur cloak thing. Yeah, she's like a really strong sort of, um, very strong woman, or quote unquote strong man, where you lift with like massive boulders and stuff. Like that's really how strong she is. So I thought to myself I should give her a neck, because the lack of a neck made her look visually unappealing, and so I wanted to add just even the minimal amount of like, let's not make our head like completely tucked in, because it just created like too many sort of round circular esque shapes. So I thought, hey, let's get a neck in there, and let's still keep the same idea of like this really strong, heavy, massive character. And there was a lot of noodling to get the shape of the face to work to the degree that I thought it would be appealing. And one of the goals is to never just settle for like, I don't know, I'm just gonna leave this in just to leave it in. And the idea is to iterate and to keep coming up with versions and variations. Even the way that I'm drawing the fur part of that cloak, I drew it a few different times to give myself, an ideal version of, do I like this or don't I like that? Always exploring the ideas of small, medium, large, and making sure that I don't create evenness is a really important element. Although there is a small degree of evenness in proportions from the top of the head to the waistline, from the waistline to the feet, which I could probably have massaged that a little bit more. to make it, a little bit more distinct. But I like the evenness of it, and I left it because it, in a way, it made it feel part of her design. That although she is this really burly character and she's got a gruffness to her, that there's also like an evenness to her. Like there's an even keel to who she is as a person, and that she is not a, ideally in my mind, she's not a one dimensional character. So what I did is I decided I was going to go with this single line ballpoint, just because I kind of like the texture of the line, which it did make it a little bit difficult when the color fills, because sometimes with the more texture brushes in Harmony, that when you do color fills, sometimes it doesn't go all the way to the edge. Sometimes. And in the process of doing the cleanup, what I usually will do is I'll usually just put the my sketches in a blue line or red line on the color layer, so that I can redraw on top of it on the line layer. And you can still see that I'm going in, I'm changing some things, I'm still adding some things. Even when you redraw it, you still need to think about, design wise, is am I satisfying the elements of what I need to make this design work? And that there's no point in this process that, from thumbnail to cleanup to eventually if you go color and all that, that you're not looking at the design and asking yourself, are there things that I can improve? Are there things that I can plus? Have I made this too similar? Should I play with contrast? And, you know, repetition. Should I do something with the repetition of this? And I intentionally made sure when I was going through the collar or through that fur part that I didn't make it super even. There may be some moments where there's some degree of evenness, but I intentionally made an effort to vary the size of those little puffy parts. Even with the jacket, I thought to myself that I should play with straight curve relationship. So I'll make the interior part of that curved and the outside part straight. Even with the hair, I thought, ooh, it'd be cooler to make the shape of this hair a little more dynamic on that outside as opposed to the opposing side. So with the boots, I drew them, and then because there's every once in a while you can cheat, because whenever you can speed something up, I always try to figure out the shortcut. So I copied and pasted it. What I did though is I did put like a line in there to give me the ground plane so that my feet would feel like they sat properly or sat well on a sort of ground plane, just so that they didn't end up looking really funky proportionally, in that it would end up making the character felt like it hovered. The feet do have or the boots or shoes do have a sort of graphic design quality to them. And you can see in the drawing the eyes that I drew all the way across to make sure that the eyes felt like they were aligned better with each other. Because even in the drawing sketching phase, it's very easy to draw stuff and then think, oh man, it looks good, and then not do the extra work of making sure that it works. For this one, I will do heavy line sort of design work, but for this one, I decided I wanted to do something where the line work was really fine. So it's like a 5 pixel line. There's no thick and thin to the line. I just made it a even line. And then for the background, what I did is I made a gradient, and I love the way swatches work in Harmony, because if I want to change something, I can change them quickly. And so I put almost everything on some sort of layer. Like, layers will save your life, especially if you need to change things. So the background is on a layer. That gradation for the background is on the layer. The character itself is on a layer by itself, but the color for the character is going to be on the same layer, but there's a line layer and a color layer to it. And then I just go through and I make a separate palette just for the character, not all of the other background stuff. Part of the reasoning for that is when I need to use the palette for this character. So if this character ever needed to be in part of an animation, then I would be able to just take the palette for this character and then reuse it over and over again without having to search through all of the palettes for all of the other random things that I did in the backgrounds and other nonsensory. So anything that's related to this character, I put in a palette by itself. And all you have to do is when you go to your palettes, you could just hit plus and you can add a new palette and it'll just be for, and you could just name it whatever you want. Name it your character's name so that you can keep track of it. And then it's the coloring part of working in Harmony is just you make swatches, assign it, and the best part of this is when you start looking at your color relationships together, it takes you no amount of time to decide like that color doesn't work, and you can double click your swatch and you can keep shifting the colors until they look good next to each other, which is for me, I really love that idea. And not just I love the idea, but process wise for production for animating, there's a number of times that I've done some stuff and uh, didn't like the colors and was able to switch colors across a whole bunch of shots really quickly because I did a bunch of stuff in Harmony. And then once I get into all the coloring things, then it's just a matter of going into the nodes and manipulating things to suit my fancy. So I'll oftentimes create some really simple blending nodes in order to do like the shadow work. So for this ground shadow, this is just a simple gradient, and when I get into the gradient, I'll just make sure that it's a color that I like, and then I decided what I want to do the shadow work for this. So this is going to look crazy, and if you're unfamiliar with doing shadows or highlights in Harmony, you'll probably be thinking this guy is insane because he's now got this hot green, and this hot green is a terrible shadow color. What is wrong with him? Nothing, because there is a node in Harmony where you can do the shadows, and what I found is that it makes it easier to identify and see where my shadows are going right or wrong by using the hottest color possible for the shadows and the hottest color possible for the highlights. The color itself doesn't actually show up. The only thing that shows up when you uh, drop the node in for it is that the whatever value is associated or color is associated with the node is what shows up. So you can use whatever color you want, but I use green because visually I can see it and I can see it quickly and I can see where it's placed and I can see where it's working and where it's not working. So that's the if you're looking at the green and you're like, why green? It's because visually it shows up really clearly, and there's no question about that's my shadow, or either it is or isn't my shadow. Like there's no question whatsoever. I know that that's what it is. So what I do is that I go in and I create um, this tone node, and I connect my shadows into that and my shadow layer, and so you can see how the node connection is and how it passes through in order to create the shadows. And what's awesome about it is that it will clip the excess off the edges, so I don't even have to go and clean up the edges. And then I make another layer for highlights, and I just pepper some highlights in a couple areas, usually in the eyes and anything metallic. And then this is a really, again, a bright highlight. Well, this is what I call lighting. So what I'll do is I'll pick another really bright color that I'm not really using for anything. Sometimes I'll do red, but in this case I just use yellow because you know I just was like yellow's cool. So this is just so I could find areas where I could put light. It's not a highlight, it's just light where the light would fall. I did go in and make sure that the shading node doesn't do really smooth shading because I do want it to feel a little bit more like a cartoon where there's cell shading where you get a much stronger crisper edge and not a super soft edge. So I love these nodes because I don't have to be perfect inside the lines. I can be really messy, and then again it'll clip off the edges as long as you're connecting them to the proper node. So the highlight node connects um, into the same node system where your character is. So you just connect it lower, and then you connect the light node into it, the light painted node into it, and so then you'll have this node where you have tone, and then you'll have light, and they're all inside that same sort of node structure. So it makes it fast and easy to change them and modify them really quickly. And If you ever have questions, you could always hit me in the comments. You can ask me, and I'll run through it. I have a number of videos that are a little bit slower that kind of step you through the process, but like working in Harmony and doing this stuff, it's super fast and super easy, and it allows you to change things really quick. But make sure you do all the iteration process, because skipping to the end and just drawing a character is not the ideal goal for if you're designing characters. So hit me in the comments. I will answer whatever questions you might have, because you may have questions. This is kind of an overview of going from the beginning all the way to the end of designing a character.